Chapter 21, Show Off or Demonstrate. Exhausted, Jianyun lay down on her bed. She only stood up once to get a glass of water, but other than that, she buried herself under the bed covers as her mind fluttered elsewhere. In the past few days, her life seemed to have unraveled for the worse. With newfound enemies in the office to old faces coming back to town, she felt agitated just by thinking of them. Picking up her phone, she decided to scroll through her WeChat, only to see a few messages popping up. Yen, are you feeling better? I was afraid you might be asleep, so I didn't call you. It was Wu Wenjing. She replied with a smile before scanning over all her other school group chats. In the past few years, she had no idea why so many group chats had popped out from people in her preschool to those in her university. They were all over the place, catching up with various events as they capture and share their own gossip along the way. Aside from the people back in her high school, Jianyun didn't remember many of her classmates. In fact, she didn't even know how these people could chat so amicably, as if not a day had passed since they had last seen each other. Tonight, her high school group had been blowing up. Jianyun saw someone tagging her, so she had to click into the group and see what they were talking about. The chat was practically bursting with compliments that she had to scroll up to see the picture. In the frame was a very stylish couple. Although the woman's bright face was covered with a pair of large sunglasses, that still didn't hide the beauty of her glistening skin and sweet smile. There, she was leaning against a handsome man who also had a large grin on his face. The couple looked incredibly intimate from the way their arms wrapped around each other. As her thumb grazed across the screen, she froze. Suddenly, all the humiliation and resentment that had been hidden deep inside her heart gushed out. Her fingers clenched around her phone as she struggled to calm herself. Of course she knew them. How could she not? Lin Lanlan and Xu Haiyang were her best friends, yet it seemed that in time, they had grown to be her worst enemies. Her eyes had turned bloodshot, and a ball rose up to her throat. Suddenly, the cold breeze wasn't enough to cool her down as she kicked the covers from her body, shaking wildly. It's been a while since Jianyun had seen that woman, but even after 6 years, the hatred she had for Lin Lanlan still hadn't faded. So was Lin Lanlan trying to show off her beau? Or perhaps she was only demonstrating how their love still remained strong throughout the years, while hers remained broken and unhinged. Not only did that bitch stole him away from her, but she had also spilled a secret that would forever follow Jianyun in the shadows. It was that day when Jianyun had lost everything, her home, her family, and even the love of her life. When she glanced back at her phone again, she stared at the man behind Lin Lanlan. His arms were encircled her waist as his eyes glistened with so much love that it was enough to make her want to vomit. Xu Haiyang, the man who had promised to never leave her, had betrayed her, and now he was showing off his love as if he had thought nothing of their past. Jianyun closed the photo and looked away. Her nose crinkled in disgust. Just then, another notification popped up from her WeChat. At first, Jianyun thought that it was another picture from her group chat until she caught a glimpse of the screen from the corner of her eye. It was Huo Liancheng. Her heart started doing backflips and she scrambled up. It was almost 11 o'clock. Why was he messaging her this late at night? She opened the message and saw a total of 3 words. Are you asleep? Not yet, she replied a minute later. Jianyun waited for a short while, but when he didn't reply, she set her phone back onto her bedside table and breathed a sigh of relief. Even as she rested her head onto the cushions, she still couldn't get the man out of her mind. Her thoughts drifted back to all the times they had interacted with each other. At this point, there was no predicting what Liancheng would do next. That night in the coffee shop, although he had helped her, he wiped his hands with a tissue right after as if he had touched a piece of dirt. However, after what seemed to be their last meeting, he had helped her into his car and took her to the hospital. The man's gestures may have been nice and sweet, but the words he had said to her back at the car were enough to fuel her anger towards him. To him, they were simply acquaintances. And judging from his attitude towards Xia Bingbing, the woman who was said to be carrying his child, he didn't seem to be the man who's kind enough to send a stranger to the hospital. And the way he had kissed her back at the elevator. She just couldn't understand him. Just as her thoughts drifted even further, her phone vibrated once again, snapping her out of her reverie. Are you feeling better? It had been 15 minutes since his last message. Jianyun initially wanted to ignore him, but curiosity got the better of her. Better. Liancheng's reply was quicker this time. Sleep early. You should too. Jianyun had already typed out the words before deleting it all of a sudden. She chewed on her bottom lip as she gazed at his last message. It had been a few minutes of her typing and deleting, and she still didn't know how to respond. No matter how she had panned out the words, they still sounded like a couple greeting each other good night. This was already awkward enough. Not knowing what else to say or how to respond, she decided to shut off her phone and slept. At this point, she might as well let it go. At the same time, in the most bustling area of Qinghu City, the luxurious club Myth Hall was practically pulsing with music. As millions of people crowded around the club, their hips swayed to the raging beat as their arms waved up in the air. However, far across the corridor, There were private rooms set up, restricted for their VIP guests. There, the loud music had grown more mellow as a peaceful silence radiated across the hallway. Mr. Huo, you've been staring at your phone the whole night, that I'm starting to wonder if you already have a woman in your life. A man in his 30s squinted at Lian Cheng, who had been glancing at his phone for the last 30 minutes. He held a glass of wine in his hand and nudged him. Although the girls in my club don't have much to offer, they're all certainly beautiful. With your charm, you could pick any girl from the club, and I'm sure she would be begging you to take her right then and there. Pu Shigan, stop with your bullshit. We all know these women couldn't compare to the talents this club had back in the day. Another man patted his large belly before shaking his head. A few years ago, their faces and bodies are as bright as fine jade with a smell as sweet as flowers. Your dancers can't come close to that. Well, the business isn't as good as it had been as well, he exclaimed. The higher-ups had tightened our budget, so I can't go around and hire the pretty ones either. Remember the woman who dances for you every weekend? She's pretty, isn't she? The fat man leaned back as his eyes glistened with nostalgia and lust. It was a disgusting sight. She's hot and she's flexible. Pu Jigang agreed before glancing at Lian Cheng. You should have seen her, Mr. Huo. She's a raw talent, that one, and you would have liked her very much. There were tons of men who come out here every weekend just to see her dance. During those times, I don't even have a proper view at the front myself. And I'm the boss. Is that so? Huo Liancheng waited for a long time. Seeing as Jian Yun still hadn't replied, he placed his phone back on the table and took a sip of his red wine. He didn't seem interested in listening to their conversation. Huo Liancheng and Pu Jigan had been doormates back when they were studying at Harvard University. Given his money and his connections, he graduated and opened his own club. Although he had been doing well in the first few years, his revenues had fallen after the integration of newer and stricter policies. Although they weren't close, Pu Jigan had invited him over many times for a drink. It was only tonight when he had reluctantly agreed. After drinking and catching up, Huo Liancheng got up and was about to leave. Pu Jigan originally wanted to be good friends with Liancheng, given the man's esteemed connections. He was overjoyed that the man actually showed his face tonight, and now that it was getting late, he knew for a fact that his time was already up. Although they had chatted, it seemed that their friendship had progressed nowhere. He had tried and invited a few dancers from the club to serve him, but Liancheng didn't even bother glancing at them. And Pu Jigang understood why. Given Liancheng's prestigious family background, he must have seen many other beauties from different places in the world who were far better than the ones he had in the club. It seemed that only a special, one-of-a-kind woman could warm the man's icy exterior. Shaking his head, he leaned back on his seat. Chapter 22, Sue You for Defamation. By the time Jian Yun woke up, it was already the next morning. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, shining over her face. Squinting, she grabbed her phone and opened her WeChat. Besides her school group chat, there were no other messages. She wasn't the least bit interested when it came to what her classmates were talking about. After all they ever do was swoon over and compliment their better-off classmates, and the only reason they'd do that was to snatch a few opportunities up for themselves. Besides, Jian Yun had never been a social butterfly. Tossing the phone onto her desk, she pulled the covers over her head and sighed. Although she didn't want to go to work today, she had no other choice. After washing up and putting on her clothes, Jian walked out of her room to see a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. The corners of her lips quirked up into a smile. Luo Yanyan must have prepared it for her before rushing off to first period. Since it was still early, she decided to sit down and eat first. Well, this was definitely a better start to a day. Just as she had taken a sip of her milk, her phone rang out. "Grandpa," Jian Yun greeted as she picked up the phone. "Yun, will you be visiting tonight?" her grandfather Ouyang Cheng asked from the other end of the line. There was a certain eloquence and familiarity in his tone that she couldn't help but chuckle. It had been a long time since they had last spoken to each other. She had lived with her grandparents when she was younger, so she got along with her grandfather really well. Some might say that they were as thick as thieves back in the day, and she always used every opportunity she had to visit them. Tonight, however, was different. "Not tonight. I'm going on a blind date." "Is this your mother's doing?" Ouyang Cheng frowned and sighed, sounding displeased. This was always the case whenever he knew of her blind date shenanigans, as he'd like to call it. "You know that you don't have to put yourself out there just to get a good man, right? I have to talk to your mother about this." Although her grandfather didn't say anything, she knew that he was still worried about her and her mother. No wanting him to overthink any of this, she waved her hand and forced her voice to sound as light as possible. "I'm actually going back to Bushan to see Mom tomorrow," she suggested. "If I come back early, I could stop by and visit. Anyway, I have to work now. I'll call you when I'm able." Once they had said their goodbyes, she hung up the phone and left the apartment. When Jian Yun had arrived at the company, it was 8 a.m. Although she was right on time, it certainly didn't seem so. All the elevators were crowded with people as everyone tried to squeeze himself in. As uncomfortable as the experience may be, she felt at ease with more of her coworkers surrounding her. This way, the lingering fear she had of elevators could be mitigated. However, the moment she stepped out of the elevator, Wu Wenjing rushed towards her. Yun, you're here. What's wrong? Jian Yun shrugged off her coat. That Xia bitch came in early to look for you. She asked me to tell you to head straight to her office once you've arrived, she replied. A stricken look encompassed her features as she leaned in closer. She looks angry, so you have to be careful, okay? As if the day couldn't get any worse, she also noticed a few of her colleagues pointing fingers at her yet again. It seemed that the gossip around her relationship with Liancheng still hasn't dissolved completely. Aren't they tired of talking about it? Jian Yun snapped, more to herself than to her friend, wanting nothing more than to drive them away. Who knows? Wu Wenjing curled her lips in agreement. Although she held on to gossip as if it were her life force, she certainly wasn't this shameless. They've already been dragging it out ever since the elevator incident. It seemed that being in the HR department had its own ups and downs. From being the first to receive any information to being the face of ridicule, Jian Yun had already seen and experienced it all. Placing her coat and bag onto her desk, she took a deep breath and headed to the manager's office. The HR staff gazed piteously at her back. Having seen the fierceness of their new manager, they knew that going inside her office was like going inside a lion's den. No good news can come out of it. She knocked on the door, and a cool voice sounded from the inside. Come in. Pushing the door open, she saw Xia Bingbing sitting on the leather seat. Her legs were crossed and her arms were folded on her chest. She gazed at Jian Yun with enough arrogance to match an emperor. You were looking for me, Manager Xia? Xia Bingbing slammed her hand onto the table and glared at her. If looks could kill, she would have already been buried 10 feet under the ground. Who the hell gave you the guts to leave my office without a leave of absence? She snapped. It was a good thing that Jian Yun had already prepared for this. I did apply for a leave, but you weren't there. Cheng Mu's was the one who had approved my absence. I didn't expect for you to hook up with his assistant as well. When Xia Bingbing heard her excuse, all she could see was red. Her fingers dug into her palms so hard that it was enough to leave a mark. Don't think I'm not aware of women like you, those who would do practically anything just to succeed in life, even if it means sleeping with various men just to get to the top. You've slept with Cheng Mu's, haven't you? Perhaps it's those crazy martial arts you did that had attracted him. Since you already had him, who's your next target? Liancheng? Maybe you even planned the entire elevator scheme just to get him to want you, huh? Well, let me tell you right now, that Liancheng would never be interested in the likes of you. Jian Yun simply crossed her arms and stared at the woman sitting behind her desk. Her face showed indifference. Being mad at a lunatic just wasn't worth it. What the hell are you doing with your phone? Realizing that something was wrong, Xia Bingbing stopped. Recording you, she said matter-of-factly, holding her phone even higher. Manager Xia, is there anything else you'd like to add, just so I get to add more evidence when I sue you in court for slander? You. Xia Bingbing was so angry that her face had turned red. Her eyes widened by a fraction, looking like a beast who had just been mangled. Yet no matter how many times she sputtered and choked, no words came out from her lips. If there's nothing else, then I'll be heading out now. Jian Yun remained expressionless. If the woman wanted to play, then so be it. She wasn't going to be some doormat the woman could walk on. Jian Yun had never been the type of person to offend anyone. In fact, ever since she had entered Ming's, she had kept a low profile. With popularity came with endless trouble, that she knew for a fact, so she would do anything just to steer herself away from the spotlight. Once the door had closed behind her, Wu Wenjing gave her a thumbs up as she laughed. It seems I've trained you well, she teased. The two of them hadn't taken more than a few steps when they heard frantic screams bellowing from the office. What soon followed were a bunch of papers and books crashing onto the floor. Despite wincing from the sudden noise, the two shared one last smile and headed back to their work areas. Towards the end of her morning shift, Jian Yun received a message. Call me Jing, Yun. I got some news. I heard that Xia Bingbing's the granddaughter of the chairman in Ming's enterprise. We can't afford to offend her anymore. She's the one who started it. I know, and she's such a moron. I don't even know how she became our manager. Either way, it's probably best if we just avoid her for now. After all, who knows what else she'd do. True. Jian Yun knew that Wu Wenjing was worried for her. If the rumors were true, and that Xia Bingbing was his granddaughter, then they were goners. A contract wouldn't be able to save them from their stay if the chairman himself was determined to kick them out. And their reputation in the industry would be finished. However, there was no way Jian Yun would allow herself to suffer passively from the woman's wrath. Jian Yun rubbed her forehead in a daze. Although she was used to the workload, there was something about these past few days that had given her more of a headache than any of those previous months combined. Perhaps it was time to take a break. Besides, she had already saved up enough money to take care of her mother's surgery fees. Now, all she needed was to wait for a doctor to give her a go signal. Once everything was arranged, she'd be able to take her mother back to the capital. However, just as she thought of resigning from her job, a cold and handsome face flashed in her mind. She blinked, shaking the thought away. Why did she suddenly think of Liancheng? Not paying much heed to it, Jian Yun fixed up her documents. Whatever. It was probably because she hadn't gotten a night of good sleep in ages. At lunchtime, in the company's second dining hall, Jian Yun and Wu Wenjing were enjoying their meal when Chen Muzi suddenly sat beside them. Chapter 23, Elevator Phobia. You don't mind, do you, Sister Jian? Chen Muzi glanced over at her with a smile. Waving her hand, she bit back a laugh. Of course not. Why is the special assistant to the CEO suddenly gracing us lowly staff workers with his presence? Seeing that the man held no pretenses, Wu Wenjing decided to tease him. Should we be honored? It's because of these beauties sitting in front of me that I've decided to step down from my high throne and grace the world with my handsome face. His eyes glinted jokingly, and they burst into laughter. From all the drama that had happened in the last few hours, this was definitely a well-deserved break for each of them. Chen Muzi had eaten a few mouthfuls before he looked up at Jian Yun. Speaking of, how have you been? Not too shaken up from the accident, I hope? She was about to shake her head when Wu Wenjing butted in. She isn't too shaken up, but it has definitely increased her fear of elevators. I'm afraid that Yun has rotten luck when it comes to them. Maybe I could suggest that President Huo moves the entire HR department to the first floor so that Sister John doesn't have to take the elevator. He leaned back against his seat, looking as if he was in deep thought. You know what? That may be the best idea we've had since yesterday. Wu Wenjing clasped her fingers together as if she had just thought about it. Masking her laughter with a solemn look, she gazed at her friend questioningly. What do you think, Miss Jian? Would that be enough to quell your fears? Stop it, both of you. Although Jian Yun had laughed over their preposterous suggestions, she realized that many of her coworkers may have overheard them. After all, they were in the cafeteria. If these people had seen how they joked so casually over President Huo, they might assume that something's up. Waving her hand dismissively, she shifted the topic to something else. The three of them continued to talk as they ate, enjoying each other's company. Once their lunch break was over, Chen Muzi took out his phone and handed it to her. Sister John, add me on WeChat. I didn't know that you also use WeChat. Didn't you say you just came back from overseas? Wu Wenjing interrupted, furrowing her eyebrows. Well, as they say, you do as the Romans do. Hey, you're slow getter, huh? That's an interesting nickname. Pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, he handed his phone to the other woman. Sister Wu, add me as a friend too. The more, the merrier, right? Once he had added the two of them, Chen Muzi pushed his plate to the side and stood up. I'll be heading back to work. He grinned wolfishly and motioned to his phone. Text me when you're free. As soon as he had left, Wu Wenjing immediately leaned over to her and grabbed her arm. Her bright eyes glinted mysteriously as a secretive smile spread across her lips. Jian Yun couldn't help but peer towards her, wondering what she was going to say next. Do you think he likes you? Suppressing the urge to roll her eyes, she shoved her friend. Do you think every guy we met is out to get me? They should probably have you transferred to the advertising department with all the stories you make up. Jian Yun snorted. But if he doesn't like you, why would he add you on WeChat? He added you on WeChat? Does that mean he's interested in you too? The man just wants to be friends. Not being able to stand her friend's insistence, she pushed her plate and stood up. It's time to head back. However, there was something about Wu Wenjing's words that had crept to the back of her mind. Her fingers tightened around her phone as Huo Liancheng flashed into her mind. He had added her on WeChat. Did that mean? No. Even the mere thought of it was preposterous enough. Since it was Friday, she usually had a lesser workload, and by morning, she had already finished up scanning most of her documents. However, by the time she had returned to her cubicle, she found a new stack of documents scattered around her desk. It seemed that Wu Wenjing's warning was coming to life. Since Xia Bingbing couldn't do anything to scare her off, she decided to change her strategy and increased her workload instead. You're not allowed to get off work until every single one of these documents has been read and filed. The woman had grinned triumphantly before striding back to her office as if she had achieved an Olympics medal. With a groan, Jian Yun collapsed onto her seat and started to work. Jian Yun had been extremely busy the entire afternoon. Knowing that Xia Bingbing would use any vulnerability to attack her, she had put in all her effort in checking and filing every single one of the documents, making sure that all of them were spotless. However, with so much effort also came with so much wasted time. Even with Wu Wenjing's help, she still had a thick stack of documents sitting on her desk. And by the time it was 8 o'clock, she was still nowhere near finished. Yun, I have an appointment tonight. I have to go, Wu Wenjing apologized, rubbing the back of her neck in embarrassment. Go ahead. She was so busy that she didn't even have the time to raise her head. Besides, there aren't many documents left. I could finish up from here. But the elevator? Didn't I take the elevator this morning? I'll be fine, Jian Yun hurriedly insisted with a smile. When in reality, her heart was in utter turmoil at the thought of standing in that contraption all by herself. But she didn't say another word. She waved at her friend's retreating figure before looking back at all the documents left on her desk. The pale artificial lighting spread across the empty space as the cold wind blew from the window pane. As darkness shrouded the corners of the building, she couldn't help but shiver. It was already getting late. Not wanting to delay herself any longer, she threw herself back into work. By the time all her paperwork had been taken care of, she glanced at her watch to see that it was already 8:10. Jian Yun locked the documents in the drawer and pulled on her coat, preparing to leave. As she was pulling her coat over her shoulders, she noticed her phone lighting up every once in a while. Upon closer look, Jian Yun saw multiple missed calls from her mother. Thinking that it was an emergency, she immediately called back. Jian Yun, where are you? Your date's been waiting for you for half an hour. Mrs. Jian's panicked voice sounded from the other end of the line. It was then when she remembered her blind date tonight. Resisting the urge to sigh, she dragged her aching body from her desk. I forgot? She apologized. I had a lot of work to do in the office today, so it slipped my mind. I'll go right now. I'll tell Mr. Zhou that you've worked overtime and would be right there. Mrs. Jian sounded even more anxious than she was. Hurry up. Even if Jian Yun didn't want to waste her time on a blind date, she didn't want to anger her mother any further. After all, with her condition, it would be unwise to trigger her. Besides, it was just one date. It couldn't be as bad as the last one she had gone to, right? However, it seemed that even her mother's urgency couldn't stop herself from hesitating at the sight of the elevator. As she stood by the hallway, waiting for the doors to open, her fingers shook in anxiety as beads of sweat trickled down the side of her neck. Flashes of blackened walls appeared in her mind, and she staggered back, looking as if she had been struck by lightning. 6 years ago, she was also in an elevator accident where she had been trapped there for more than an hour. It had taken enormous strength on her part to step out of her comfort zone and get into one again. But it seemed that Wu Wenjing was right. She really did have rotten luck when it came to elevators. A few seconds had passed, and the elevator had finally arrived. As the doors widened, she could see no one but mirrors and walls greeting her at the other end. Her fingers curled into small fists, and she gritted her teeth. Should she go in? Should she stay here? God, even the mere thought of stepping into one made her want to vomit. The elevator doors had closed, and she inched away. Fortunately, she wasn't wearing any heels today, so maybe taking the staircase can be an alternative, a more tiring alternative, anyway. However, as she gazed at the contraption behind her, taking the stairs seemed even more tempting. Jian Yun was about to turn around when a soft ding sounded behind her. When she turned around, she saw that it was the CEO's private elevator, but it wasn't empty. There, Wu Liancheng stood in all his glory with his finger pressing on the button. His dark eyes narrowed towards her, and she found herself freezing like a deer caught under the headlights. Seeing as she was still in a daze, he snapped, "Get in," as if his words had woken her up. Jian Yun instinctively stepped into the elevator. However, as soon as her foot stepped on the surface, her heart raced in her chest that she felt as if she might explode. Was this just another coincidence? But for him to appear in front of her just as she was about to head home? No, she shouldn't think of this any further. Wu Liancheng stood at the other corner, with his back facing her. His fingers were still grazing across the buttons as the numbers gradually decreased. She used the time to stare warily at him, wondering if he'd make a move on her again. However, as she looked up at the mirror, she saw a pair of eyes gazing right back at her. Immediately, her face turned bright red in embarrassment. Chapter 24. Send her to a blind date. Jian Yun immediately gazed back down onto the floor, taking interest in her flats. Her fingers grazed across the buttons of her shirt as her other hand slid down the strands of her hair. She gritted her teeth, suddenly feeling conscious of how she looked. Was he looking at her too? She fidgeted, afraid to look in his direction again. Maybe she was just overthinking things. After all, the elevator wasn't that large, so it was expected that they'd exchange glances every once in a while. It was all probably just a coincidence. Taking a deep breath, she twisted her fingertips. That's right. Why would Huo Liancheng even gaze in her direction? Maybe he was just admiring his good looks. As the redness had faded from her cheeks, she raised her head once again, wanting to see what floor they were on. However, what she didn't expect was to be met with a pair of deep dark eyes. This time, he wasn't gazing at her through the mirror anymore. Instead, he had turned around and faced her fully. His eyes were as dark as night. The moment her gaze met with his, Jian Yun felt as if she was being drawn in another galaxy. It was like staring into Medusa's eyes, but instead of turning into stone, she was turning into a bag of mush. Her legs wobbled for support, and she couldn't help but lean back against the wall. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find it in herself to look away. Suddenly, a ding sounded, snapping her out of her thoughts. She immediately lowered her head in embarrassment. This was probably the 4th time this week. What the hell was wrong with her? Feeling the heat rushing up to her face, she rushed out of the elevator. However, as Jian Yun stared at the empty parking lot, she blinked. She had been so nervous that she didn't notice Liancheng pressing the elevator buttons. It seemed that they were in the basement. Given the dim lighting in the middle of the area, she couldn't really see much except for the shadows creeping from the walls. Furrowing her eyebrows, she turned around and was about to head back to the elevator when she bumped into Liancheng's approaching figure. There was something about his strong scent and her light fragrance that had naturally fused together. As the two figures stood close under the faint lights, the air around them had grown even more ambiguous. Her fingers slid down his suit as he held onto her back. Jian Yun's face brightened even more, and a part of her couldn't help but wonder if he knew how hard her heart was pounding. I'm sorry, she stuttered out. Not giving him a chance to say another word, she stepped back only to feel his hands snaking around her waist, preventing her from moving any further. Her legs quaked. It was a good thing he was holding her, otherwise she would have fallen onto the concrete. She cursed under her breath. Why was it that every time they meet, she was always reduced to a state of panic? Couldn't they have met in better circumstances? If Xia Bingbing could catch her now, who knows the stacks of paperwork awaiting her next week. I'll send you off. His voice sounded a bit hoarse. There's really no need. Jian Yun shook her head. I could take a taxi. Huo Liancheng glanced at his wristwatch. It's 8:20 now, 20 minutes that had passed from the date you're supposed to have with your lawyer. If you get a taxi now, you'll need to wait a good 40 minutes to get to Yushan City with all those checkpoints. He raised an eyebrow. Do you think he's going to wait for you for an hour? How could he have known? That's when she thought back to the time they had eaten dinner together. He must have heard her conversation. Even then, no matter how she had thought of the situation, she couldn't help but feel as if something was off. Why would he care about her blind date? It's not as if he was her chaperone or anything. Huo Liancheng must have read through her since he said, I'm heading to Yushan anyway, so I might as well drop you off. So that's why. Jian Yun nodded. Liancheng was the type of man who's blunt with his intentions. It would be useless for her to reject him even if she wanted to. With no other choice, she decided to agree. Besides, he had a point. If she would stand and wait for a taxi, then she'd risk wasting another hour. I honestly don't want to trouble you. Before she could finish her words, he had released his grip on her waist and strode forward. She hurriedly followed after him. Upon seeing the Bentley parked at the front, she resisted the urge to grit her teeth. This was the same car she had accidentally gone into. Without saying another word, Jian Yun opened the passenger door and got in. As they drove out of the building, she shifted in her seat. Being this close to Liancheng was enough to drive her crazy. At this point, she had to agree with Wenjing. The more she sat in the passenger seat, the more she thought of dying from a heat stroke. Maybe she shouldn't have gotten in his car. Liancheng knew that she was going on a blind date, so he probably wasn't interested in her. Maybe Jian Yun was truly just overthinking all of it. He did offer to drive her all the way there. Maybe all the kissing and flirting were just their way of forming good relations back in America. She blushed at the thought. Give me your phone. Huo Liancheng's voice rang in her ears. Not knowing what he wanted the phone for, she glanced up at him with furrowed eyebrows. Let's listen to a few songs. Jian Yun originally wanted to say that she could play a song from the radio if he wanted to. After all, the radio station had its own set of songs she could listen to. Why would he ask for her phone? However, as she gazed up at his firm grip, she immediately took his phone from her bag and handed it to him. The songs on her phone were filled with American pop songs. It must not have suited Liancheng's taste, given that he continued pressing the next button. She leaned back on her seat, listening to the change of tune, until a sharp voice echoed from the speaker. I didn't expect for you to hook up with his assistant as well. Don't think I'm not aware of women like you, those who would do practically anything just to succeed in life, even if it means sleeping with various men just to get to the top. You've slept with Cheng Mu's, haven't you? Well, let me tell you right now that Liancheng would never be interested in the likes of you. Xia Bingbing's voice echoed across the car, and she froze. By the time she had scrambled up from her seat, the recording was already over, and he had heard the whole thing. Liancheng gripped the phone in his hand, but she didn't dare move. Instead, she covered her flushed face and lowered her head. "Oh my God," she murmured to herself over and over again, wanting nothing more than for the land to swallow her up. Why did it have to be this recording? Of all the things he could have listened to. Out of the corner of his eyes, he caught sight of her exasperated actions. His lips twitched up into a small smile. When Xia Bingbing had finished talking, Huo Liancheng didn't press the button anymore. Soon, soothing music came from the stereo, but even that wasn't enough to wipe the humiliation from her face. After a long silence, Jinyun took a deep breath. It was just a recording. It doesn't have any meaning." "Ah." He didn't react much. "If you don't like it, I could delete it." Not knowing what he meant, she reached out to grab her phone. After all, Xia Bingbing was his girlfriend, and she was pregnant with his child. At the thought of him hearing her threats, her gut stirred. So much for making a better impression. Seeing as she was going to delete the recording, he reached out and grabbed her hand, stopping her. "No, keep it," he ordered. The moment his hand grazed against hers, she immediately retracted. Realizing that he was gazing at her, she flushed again. It seemed that her embarrassment would never end. Chapter 25. You're scared of me? Are you afraid of me? Huo Liancheng placed his hand back on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead. "No," Jianyun mumbled, rubbing her arm subconsciously. Her gaze fell on the shadowed outline of his hand. His hand gripped the leather surface with precision, as his other hand wrapped around the gearshift. He had beautiful hands. If she didn't know who he was, she would have assumed that he was a pianist. Although she had just stated that she wasn't afraid of him, Jianyun wanted nothing more than to step out of the car and sprint to the other side of the city. She sank deeper into her seat, turning her attention to the window. It's as if he didn't have a girlfriend, from the way he talked and touched her. The mere thought of his fingers brushing against her skin sent shivers down her spine. What the hell did he want from her? He didn't say anything else, and silence intervened. The only thing that could be heard was the robotic commands given by his navigation system. Her anxiety was slowly mitigated, but even then, she couldn't help but let her imagination run wild. She squeezed her phone close to her chest. Why didn't he ask her to delete the recording? Wasn't that offensive? Or was he testing her? Pressing against the screen, she suppressed a sigh. Just then, Jianyun glanced up to see that the car had stopped. "We're here," Huo Liancheng stated with a voice as monotonous as the navigation system. Not knowing what else to say, she lowered her head and murmured softly, "Thank you." Jianyun stepped out of the car and walked away. Just as she had arrived by the entrance of the coffee shop, she turned around to see that his car was nowhere to be seen. With a sigh of relief, she glanced at her wristwatch. It was already 8:45, 45 minutes late for her blind date. God, her mother was going to kill her. Readying herself for his absence, she stepped into the warm atmosphere and looked around, but to her surprise, Zhou Shalong was still there. She could recognize him a mile away with all the paperwork scattered across his desk. The man was bent over his computer, unaware of her presence. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Zhou Shalong?" Jianyun asked politely. "Yes, I am." The man slowly raised his head. Immediately, his eyes lit up. "You are?" "Jianyun." She gracefully sat down and folded her hands over her lap. Although she didn't want a blind date and had no intention of going on one in the first place, she still had to show some face. It's the least she could do. Besides, the man didn't look half bad. "I'm sorry for coming in late. The office asked me to work overtime, and I wasn't able to keep track of the time. I must have kept you waiting." "It's really no big deal, Auntie already told me." All the annoyance Zhou Shalong had for his date had vanished in an instant. His eyes widened. He didn't expect that he'd be asked to go on a blind date with such a pretty woman. How could he stay mad at her? After Jianyun sat down, the waiter immediately came over to ask if she wanted to order anything. "Just water," she responded. "You don't like coffee?" He closed his laptop. "Not really." It was only then when Jianyun got a better look at his face. Although he wasn't as handsome as President Huo, there was a certain elegance in his features. There was something about his sweet smile and bright eyes that left a good impression on her. A slow smile slipped into her lips. "Then I guess we have that in common." Zhou Shalong chuckled. "I'm more of a tea guy myself." At the same time, in a more secluded area not far from where Jianyun was sitting, Huo Liancheng sat down. Although he could see the shadow of her figure, he couldn't really tell what they were doing or even talking about. "Fourth bro, when you said you wanted to treat me to a meal tonight, I wasn't expecting it to be here." Sitting opposite to Liancheng was a man in his mid-20s, although his genuine expression made him seem even younger. Xiao Yichen crossed his arms and looked around the room in displeasure, seemingly unimpressed by its colored exterior. Motioning to his coffee, he grumbled, "Even the coffee's low grade. You know I only drink kopi luwak. If you don't shut up, I'll make you eat the shit that it was fermented from," he sapped. After enduring the cold silence, he noticed that ever since Liancheng came in, he had been staring out their private room. Following his gaze, he saw a beautiful young woman seated across them. Xiao Yichen bit back a laugh. "It seems you've finally taken a fancy for someone. Waggling his eyebrows, he continued to tease. And I have to say, you have great taste. She's pretty. Just then, he frowned. Wait, didn't Cheng Musa said that you liked someone from Ming's married them? Why would you? I get it. As they say, you have to cast your net to get a feel of different women before you make your choice. That's a smart strategy if I ever saw one like it. However, Huo Liancheng didn't say another word. He merely shot Xiao Yichen a look, and that immediately shut the younger man up. Although that had quieted him down for a while, Yichen wasn't the type to be intimidated so easily. Not long after, he started to speak. But it seems that the woman is already dating someone, and it looks like they're getting along quite well. Looks like a success, if you ask me. A cold feeling stirred in his gut. Just as he was about to turn and dodge, he was slapped at the backside of his head. Xiao Yichen bent over from the impact as his forehead bumped against the tea table in front of them. Raising his hand, he felt a bump across his forehead and scowled at Huo Liancheng. Why did you have to hit me? Liancheng didn't say anything to respond to his accusation, but that still didn't remove the dangerous glint in his eyes. He was like a predator hunting out for his next prey. It seemed that a hit on the head had caused enough brain damage because Xiao Yichen didn't seem to get the point. Instead, he clasped his hands together and peered at the couple in front of them. He chuckled. See? They even exchanged numbers, he whispered excitedly like a sports commentator. As I've said, the date was a success. This time, Huo Liancheng didn't hit him on the head. Instead, he stood up and kicked over the tea table, knocking the younger man on the stomach. As Xiao Yichen groaned, he used this time to stand up and leave him there. His eyebrows were scrunched up in annoyance. It was only when Liancheng had finally walked out of the door did he finally recover. Xiao Yichen waved his fist up in the air, crying out, Did you really call me all the way over here just to beat me up? He stared at the table that had been kicked over and glanced up at the waiter hurrying towards him. Yichen touched his wallet with a sigh. Well, at least he had brought his wallet today, or else he was dead. Although Jian Yun didn't have any intention of getting married anytime soon, or perhaps even going on another date, she had to admit that Zhou Xiaolong seemed to be a good person. At least he wasn't as superficial as the man she had seen a few days ago and was certainly far better looking than him. Tonight, they had a good time. Even if it didn't work out between them, he was still like a friend to her. So when Zhou Xiaolong had asked to exchange numbers, she agreed immediately. However, Jian Yun couldn't help but feel a little queasy tonight. From the moment she sat down, she felt as if there was a pair of eyes staring at her back, watching her every move. She tapped her fingers onto the table impatiently, as if she was expecting for something or someone to pop out of nowhere. Furthermore, the cafe wasn't as quiet as it had been a few days ago. She could hear a few cries and loud hits from the back of the room. There must be a fight going on. As Zhou Xiaolong was speaking, he noticed that Jian Yun was staring in another direction. She seemed distracted. He knocked on the table a few times, following her gaze. What are you looking at? Snapping out of her reverie, she glanced up at him. Oh, nothing. Yet even then, Jian Yun couldn't shake off the anxiety creeping up to her. She could have sworn she had seen Huo Liancheng from the crowd. But that was impossible. Why would he be here, of all places? She fidgeted. It was probably just a side effect of being under so much pressure lately. Where do you live? I'll send you off. Zhou Xiaolong smiled, satisfied with tonight's outcome. It's fine. Besides, my place isn't far from here. It's far more convenient for me to take the bus. After all, this was their first meeting. Even if she had a good impression of him, she still couldn't be too sure of him. At least, not yet. All right then. Be careful, okay? Zhou Xiaolong nodded. Not forcing himself onto her. She smiled. Truly, this man was probably one of her better dates. The two of them walked towards the entrance of the cafe. Coincidentally, as they passed by another private room, Jian Yun subconsciously glanced over and spotted a familiar face. Chapter 26. Seeing Lin Lan again. Yan Yan? Jian Yun blinked. She didn't expect to see Luo Yan Yan here at all, and from the looks of it, it seemed that she was also on a blind date of her own. With a glance, she saw her friend sitting across a man who's around his mid-30s. Luo Yan Yan had her head lowered as her back faced the gleaming artificial lights, so Jian Yun couldn't see the expression in her face. However, there was something off about the atmosphere around them. Aside from the pair, there were 4 other people in the room. As Jian Yun peered closer, she could see that the middle-aged couple sitting beside Yan Yan were her parents, so that meant that the other pair was the man's parents as well. It was the first time she had seen parents directly involved in a blind date. It seemed even more awkward to see that Luo Yan Yan and the man hadn't said a word throughout the time she was standing there. Instead, the enthusiasm all came from both of their parents. It was as if the parents were the ones on a double date and not them. However, it seemed that the date was coming to an end. As the waiter brought over the bill, Luo Yan Yan glanced up to see Jian Yun standing by the doorway. Although she seemed stunned at first, she then started to shake her head helplessly, a warning that she shouldn't interfere. Jian Yun glanced back up at the middle-aged couple, and it seemed that they have grown even more heated. She could vaguely hear the words engagement wine set before deciding to head out first. At this point, it might not be the best time to interrupt them. Your friend? When she turned around, she saw that Zhou Xiaolong hadn't left yet. He raised his eyebrows. Yes, she's my college roommate. Preoccupied with her own matters, she didn't bother to explain any further. He must have noticed it because he nodded and waved. Then I'll head out first. Have a good night, Miss Jian. Jian Yun watched Zhou Xiaolong get into the elevator, making no move to follow him. Besides, she didn't have a car, and she wanted to wait for Luo Yanyan to come out and go home with her. From the looks of it, her friend may need someone to lean onto after what she had just seen. However, it seemed that the heavens had other plans for her. Instead of meeting up with Luo Yanyan, she was fated to meet another woman. Jian Yun, is that you? Before she could see who it was, a pungent smell entered her nostrils. It was enough to make anyone faint. Wrinkling her nose, Jian Yun could hear another pair of heels tapping across the concrete. Soon enough, a more screechy voice sounded from behind her. It really is you. Jian Yun, what a coincidence. Why didn't you say anything about coming here? We could have invited you over to eat. Jian Yun finally looked up to see a plump woman. The woman looked as if she was heading to the club with her bralette, short skirt, and knee-high boots. Even her face was caked with makeup. She squinted her eyes, unable to recognize her. Don't you remember me? And here I thought we were friends, the woman sighed, pretending to be displeased. I'm Chen Yue. You remember, right? I'm the one who sat in front of you back in high school. It's you. Jian Yun furrowed her eyebrows. The plain girl with a pixie cut couldn't be the heavily made-up woman right in front of her, right? Time really did change people. Just as she was about to say something else, around 7 or 8 people crowded around her. However, Jian Yun wasn't paying attention to any of them. Instead, her eyes were fixated on the woman making her way towards her. The mere sight of her caked face made her blood boil. The woman was very beautiful. With her tight black dress and crystal heels, she looked like a supermodel. There was a certain dignity from the way she held herself, and her mere presence could send anyone in complete awe. However, the moment she caught sight of Jian Yun, her stare narrowed automatically as jealousy and hatred flashed across her eyes. She was none other than Lin Lanlan. Lin Lanlan, I remembered how close you and Yun were back in high school. Why aren't you saying anything? Zhang Jing, one of their classmates, interrupted, wanting to end the awkward tension between them. Chen Yue, who was aware of their feud, tried her best to pull the woman behind her, but it seemed that Zhang Jing didn't get the hint. Instead, she barked out a laugh and clapped as if she had just discovered something. Wait, Jian Yun, I remembered you dating Xu Haiyang. I still remember how he chased you around back at school, like a little tamed puppy. It was adorable. Shut up, haven't you seen any of the chat logs? Seeing the way Lin Lanlan's face had darkened, Chen Yue hurriedly scolded the woman. Upon seeing the strange and uncomfortable looks on everyone's faces, Zhang Jing quieted down almost immediately. Jian Yun, it's been a long time. Lin Lanlan smiled, acting as if nothing had happened between them. She walked up to her and wanted to hold her hand. It's been 6 years since we last met. You still look the same, as beautiful as always. If there's anything else, I'll be leaving first. Jian Yun avoided her hand, suppressing the urge to slap her in the face. How dare she approach her after everything that had happened between them? She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms hard enough that she was afraid she'd draw blood. So many terrible memories flashed back in her mind, as if reminding her of her own idiocy. Well, since you're here, why don't we sit down and catch up? Chen Yu insisted, catching the glint in her friend's eye. I still have other things to do. Oh, please, don't tell me you'll be chasing after that guy. Lin Lanlan snorted. Jian Yun ignored her and pressed the button on the elevator. It didn't matter if the elevator would suddenly drop down on her. Even the afterlife was a better destination than this place. Just being with Lin Lanlan was like meeting the devil himself. That is, if the devil had taken interest in red lipstick and branded bags. Jian Yun, we haven't met in many years. I didn't expect that your bright ambition has been reduced to just dating any willing man on the street. What? Is Auntie still forcing you to find a man stronger than Xu Haiyang? To find a better man than him? I guess you're fresh out of luck in that department. Lin Lanlan sneered. The moment she had seen Jian Yun in the lobby, she couldn't help but be irritated. It's been years, and Jian Yun still hadn't changed. She was still incredibly beautiful. Even the man that just left on the elevator couldn't even properly focus. As if there was anything special about that bitch. Hearing her words, Jian Yan felt a burst of anger scourging through her chest, and her gaze turned cold. How dare she bring that up? Having enough, she turned around and glared at them with disdain. If you haven't mentioned it, I would have already forgotten what you've done, she said snidely. Remember the time you went on your knees just to beg me to give him to you? I guess another woman's trash can also be another woman's treasure. Tell me, how are you and Xu Haiyang doing? I mean, weren't you pregnant when you left the country? She used this time to deliberately glance at Lin Lanlan's flat stomach. I assume that by now, both of you have married, and as for your child, he must be 6 years old now. As these words left her lips, everyone became silent. Only a few people knew of what had really happened back then. When Xu Haiyang broke up and went abroad with Lin Lanlan, everyone had assumed that it was Xu Haiyang who had dumped her. They didn't expect that it was the other way around. Oh, Stop it with your bullshit. Chenyo spat. It's clear that Shu Haiyang doesn't want you. You know very well who's spouting bullshit between us. Jianyun sneered, staring at the ugly expression etched on Lin Lanlan's face. Jianyun had never been a mean person, but she would not tolerate them bullying her. Chapter 27. She is my fourth sister-in-law. Lin Lanlan had always cared about her image. The only reason why she posted those photos in the group that night was to make everyone swoon over her and her seemingly perfect life. And she had tagged Jianyun to show her a life that she could have had but never did. Tonight was also part of her plan, to show everyone how much she had achieved over the past few years. How was she supposed to know that her saintly reputation would shatter overnight? The mere thought made her clench her fists. So what? Having enough of her, Lin Lanlan raised her meticulously drawn eyebrows and raised her pinched nose up in the air. Shu Haiyang has already chosen me, and he'd always choose me. Face it, Jianyun, you'd face the same fate as your mother, destined to live a life alone. No man would ever want you, and even if they do, they can't be as great as the man you once had. Jianyun couldn't bear to see her mother being humiliated like this. Her vision had turned red, and her nostrils flared. Just as she was about to go berserk, a young man immediately rushed to her aid. His seemingly young face had darkened entirely as he pointed at Lin Lanlan. Say, did you just drink toilet water? If not, then why are you spouting shit? He cursed. Look at you. Even Sister Fen could beat you into a pulp. You have the nerve to say that no one wants my fourth sis, as if anyone would want you. Whoever does might need to get their eyes checked out. As he spoke, he even used a hand to block his nose, as if the mere smell of the woman was enough to drive him away. Lin Lanlan was immediately faced with a baby-faced man. She looked at him up and down, noticing the branded clothes that strapped around him from head to toe. He must have come from a rich family, and his bright and sunny appearance was enough to attract anyone. What she didn't expect was for him to curse at her like an uneducated sailor. Her face had turned purple in rage. What fourth sister? I don't know who you're talking about. Who the hell are you? As if you deserve to know who I am. The man snorted, looking as if he wanted to vomit at the mere sight of her. However, the small bump on his forehead made him seem less serious than what he had intended. Not even bothering to wait for her reply, he affectionately grabbed Jianyun's arm and pulled him towards her side. Since he was taller than her by half a head, he leaned over her shoulders, pretending to be a small cat. He mewed. This is my fourth sis. Hey. A chill shot down her spine. She had no idea where this man had come from, nor did she know how she became his fourth sis. Who the hell was he pairing her with? Jianyun was about to struggle under his hold when her phone rang out. Perhaps it was because of his harsh words that everyone present, even Lin Lanlan, had turned quiet. They gazed at each other hesitantly, unsure of what else to say. For a moment, no one made a sound, as if they were waiting to see if Jianyun would call out her own bluff. Fourth sis, pick it up. It could be fourth brother. The man clapped excitedly as if Christmas had rained upon them. She shot him a glare and shoved him away. Grabbing her phone, her heart immediately started beating wildly. It was as if lightning had struck her very soul as she stared at her screen. It was Huo Liancheng. Can you drive? His voice sounded the moment she picked up the phone. Yes. Not knowing why he was asking, she answered honestly. I'll give you 3 minutes. I'll be at the place where I dropped you off. Without giving her a chance to reply, he hung up. Jianyun stared at her phone for around 3 seconds as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. It was only when the baby-faced man had poked her in the sides did she finally regain her senses. Fourth brother is calling for you. If you don't go now, he might get angry. He shook her arm, sounding even more anxious than her. If he gets angry, who knows what he'll do? Jianyun blinked, looking as if she had just woken up from a dream. She glanced at her phone. It had already been half a minute, and he only gave her 3. Not having the time to ask where this childish man had come from, she held onto her bag and rushed down the stairs. At this point, taking the elevator would only delay her even more. Besides, she was only a few floors up. She sprinted. On one hand, she had to obey Liancheng's order. On the other hand, she'd take any excuse to get the hell away from Lin Lanlan's posse. As soon as she had arrived by the entrance, a luxurious Bentley caught her eye. It was parked at the side of the road. Guo Liancheng was smoking with his back facing her. He had already taken off his jacket, revealing a buttoned-up shirt. Even under the dim streetlights, she could make out his broad shoulders and muscular arms. From afar, he looked like he was shooting for a magazine. President Huo. She stepped forward, panting. Yet even if she was far away, a familiar stench of alcohol entered her nostrils. He was drunk. He slowly turned around to look at her before flicking his cigarette into the trash can right next to him. Throwing the keys at her, he opened the passenger door and got in. Drive. So that's why he was asking her earlier if she could drive. She was to act as his designated driver. Sighing in relief, she walked over and entered the Bentley. In a more enclosed space, the smell of alcohol became even stronger, and she couldn't help but wrinkle her nose in disgust. How much did he drink? Jianyun fumbled around the various buttons before starting the car. This was the first time she drove such a luxurious car, especially one as exclusive as this. Her heart raced in her chest that she wondered if he could sense how nervous she was. It wasn't until she had driven out of the vicinity did she remember something. "President Huo, where do you live?" Huo Liancheng didn't respond. When she turned to the side, she saw him leaning back against the leather seat. His eyes were closed, and 2 of his buttons were already loosened up. His breathing was slow, and even as if he had just fallen asleep. This time, even Jian Yun was speechless. Where was she going now? 10 minutes ago, Jian Yun had answered Liancheng's call and raced down the staircase. Wanting to see if this was all some elaborate joke to cover up her humiliation, they quickly followed her down the steps. The next thing they saw was her walking towards a shadowed man. Although the night was dark, they could make out his clenched jaw and muscular back. His figure was enough to make their blood boil in lust as they stared at him from afar. After exchanging a few more words, Jian Yun finally got in. "Sister Lin, what kind of car is that? How come I've never seen one like it before?" Chen Yue asked, peering at a distance. "You don't know what that is? It's a Bentley. A luxury car worth millions of dollars." A short man with skewed glasses gazed at the car with envy evident in his features. When everyone heard this, they couldn't help but gasp. "Why are you even looking at the car? We should be asking about that man over there. God, he's hot." Zhang Jing was lost in thought as she looked at his shadowed profile from the car. Her eyes glazed over as she took a step forward, looking as if she was drawn by the mere sight of the man. The other women shared the same expression. Even Lin Lanlan was rendered speechless. When did Jian Yun find such a rich and handsome boyfriend? Who just said that no one wants her? Amongst the crowd, a tall woman with long hair and glasses snorted. The corners of her mouth twitched. From the look of her boyfriend, it's no wonder she doesn't like Xu Haiyang anymore. She deliberately glanced over to Lin Lanlan, whose expression had gotten even uglier by the second. Xiao Yichen returned to the cafe with a large ice bag on his forehead. Sighing, he leaned back on his seat and spoke into the phone. "Fifth bro, at least you were able to warn me earlier. Otherwise, the man would have stabbed me to death. You had the nerve to say that fourth sis is better off with another man. You're lucky you got off with just a bruised forehead." Chen Mu's scornful voice sounded from the other line. "How the hell was I supposed to know that she's the one who fourth bro likes? It's not as if there's a label on her forehead that says so." Xiao Yichen scowled, feeling aggrieved by this fact. Not only was he not able to eat, but now he had a bruise the size of Mount Everest on his forehead. It was as if he had paid to go all this way just to get beaten up by his own friend. "Wait, Sister Jian is calling me." Cheng Mu's glanced at his phone and ignored it. A secretive smile slipped into his lips as he did so. Fourth bro always looks so serious. If he really likes the girl, couldn't he just chase after her like a regular guy? Why does he have to beat around the bush? He groaned, rolling his eyes. Just then, he noticed that the other man had gone silent. "Hey, why aren't you saying anything?" "I'm recording your words for fourth bro," Cheng Mu's answered naturally. Immediately, Xiao Yichen froze. "Fuck off." Without another word, he hung up. On the other side of the city, Jian Yun anxiously gazed at her phone. She had been calling Cheng Mu's over and over again, but he still didn't answer. It seemed that she had no other choice but to improvise. Chapter 28. Your boyfriend had too much to drink. Jian Yun decided to put her phone down and turned to Liancheng. "President Huo?" No matter how many times she had called on him, he still didn't react. As her fingers twitched on the stirring wheel, she sighed and left him alone. At this point, she had no other choice but to drive along the round to see if there were any hotels along the way. Although she didn't know where his house was located, it wasn't like she could let him sleep in the car. Not long after, Jian Yun saw a luxurious hotel on the other side of the road. Parking the car in the front, she got off and opened the passenger door. She peered at the man leaning against the leather seat, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. "President Huo, we're here." Huo Liancheng didn't move an inch. No matter how much Jian Yun had nudged him, there was still no response. She gazed at his tall height as her arms fidgeted in her sides. There was no way she could carry him all the way from the car to the hotel. Both of them would collapse onto the pavement if she tried. However, her worries soon dissipated when she saw him open his eyes. Wiping the sides of his face, he gazed up at her with narrowed eyes before turning to the bright signage on the side of the hotel. His forehead creased and he stretched his legs out of the car. Without another word, he walked into the hotel. Jian Yun raced after him. At first, she wanted to ask for his address, but after seeing his cold face, she swallowed her words. At least he was willing to stay in the hotel. That way, she didn't have to drive him all the way back. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to stay in the hotel?" There were 2 women who had greeted him by the entrance. One of the women stepped forward, and she couldn't find it in herself to look away. Her voice was as warm and sweet as honey falling from the hive, but he had paid no heed to any of them. Instead, Liancheng strode down the lobby and sat on the sofa. The 2 receptionists turned to Jian Yun, but this time, the warmth in their features had suddenly turned cold. Moreover, the jealousy was evident in their eyes as they looked her over. "You want a room?" she questioned snidely. "Yes." Jian Yun nodded. After working all day, she was already exhausted. Now all she needed was to settle President Huo in his room. and head home herself. The last thing she needed was to pick a fight with any of the receptionists, especially with something as trivial as this. Use your ID card to register, they said dryly. Although the two receptionists had seen different types of people coming in and out of the hotel, it was the first time they had seen such a charming man with looks and money to match. They held their breath, feeling envious of the woman walking with him. Jianyun immediately ran to Liancheng's side and whispered, "President Wu, have you brought your ID?" There was no response, and she had to suppress the urge to grit her teeth and leave him there. Instead, she stretched out her hand and slid down his pockets. Not thinking too much about it, she pulled out his wallet and glanced down. The address written in his identification wasn't in Qinghu City at all, so she gave up and headed towards the counter. The receptionist typed the numbers onto the computer before glancing up at her. "Miss, your card must also be registered." "Oh, I won't be staying." "Isn't your boyfriend drunk? Aren't you going to stay and take care of him?" The receptionist's face was scrunched up in disapproval as Jianyun handed over the identification card. "He's not my boyfriend." She frowned. Even then, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable from the way they were looking at him like a piece of meat. There was something about the way their eyes glistened in anticipation that made her irritated. The moment the two women had heard this, their cold demeanor changed immediately. A bit of warmth returned to their faces as they clasped their hands together. "Miss," one of them exclaimed enthusiastically, "that will be 4,800 yuan. Would you be paying in cash or card?" 4,800? Her jaw dropped. That was probably twice her rent for this month alone. "Miss, it's a 5-star hotel." The receptionist pointed at the sign. "It's really not that expensive, given that you've booked a room in one of our low seasons." Jianyun opened his wallet, only to see that besides the card, there wasn't enough cash to cover the fee. Her hand subconsciously went to her pockets, as her fingers grazed over her own card. Was she going to use the money she had saved up for her mother's surgery? Glancing over at Liancheng, she noticed that he had already changed his position. He was already sitting down as his hand rubbed his forehead, looking as if he was suffering from a migraine. She wanted to ask him if she could use his card, but she felt that it wasn't appropriate. Besides, he didn't even look half awake. Even if she had asked, she might not get an answer. "Miss, do you still want a room?" The receptionist became impatient. "No thanks." Not wanting to waste any more money, Jianyun put her wallet away and walked to his side. She ignored their scornful stares and whispered, "President Wu, I'm so sorry, but I don't have enough money. How about you come to my house for the night?" There was a tentative tremor in her voice. She had hoped that Wu Liancheng would wake up and tell her the passcode of his card. It was either that, or he'd tell her the address. Either way, any alternative was better than him going into her house. That was definitely the last resort. However, when he had heard her words, he suddenly looked up at her. Jianyun staggered back, surprised to see the redness in his eyes. "President Huo, your eyes." "It's fine, let's go." Rubbing his eyes, he walked out without saying another word. Jianyun ran after him again. Once they had gotten into the car, she glanced at his bloodshot eyes and shook her head. What she actually wanted to say was, "Since you're already awake, you can tell me your address, and I'll send you home." However, before the words could reach her throat, she found herself more at a loss of what to say. With a sigh, she started the car and headed back to their apartment. By the time she had brought him back to her apartment, it was already 11 p.m. Liancheng didn't say another word along the way. When they got back to her house, he immediately collapsed onto the bed, obviously exhausted from the long night they both had. Seeing him breathing more evenly, Jianyun guessed that he must have already fallen asleep. She stepped towards him, noticing how his lips were shaped into a straight line and how his eyes were squeezed tightly shut. It was as if he was in deep pain. When she touched his forehead, she jolted back. He was burning. Although she didn't know how much he had drunk today or why he had been drinking too much, Jianyun had to say that President Huo wasn't the most awful man on the planet. Without making too much of a fuss, he had fallen straight to sleep. At least he wasn't the type of person who'd go crazy after having too much to drink. Although she didn't have much experience in taking care of drunk people, Jianyun had seen her mother take care of her father back when they were still together. She wrung a hot towel to wipe his face, undid a few buttons in his shirts, and took off his shoes. Jianyun originally wanted to take off his pants, but the moment her fingers had grazed against his belt, she immediately retracted her hand. In the end, she had only mustered the courage to loosen his belt buckle. Once she had done this, Jianyun patted her chest and heaved a sigh of relief. "That was close," she murmured to herself. "If I had really taken off his pants, I won't be able to explain it tomorrow." However, even as she was done, various thoughts flooded her mind. Since he was sleeping in her bed, where was she going to stay? Jianyun gazed at the windowsill, feeling the nightly breeze enter the room. If he was sleeping on her bed, then she might as well sleep on the floor, right? What if she and Luo Yanyan just shared the room? At the thought of her friend, she suddenly realized something. After all the ruckus Jianyun had caused upon entering the room, why didn't Luo Yanyan come out of her room? Was she really that tired from her date? Jian Yun slowly tiptoed towards her room and knocked on her door. When there was no response, she pushed the door open and peered inside, only to see an unruffled bed. Luo Yanyan still hadn't come back yet. Where was she? Jian Yun and Luo Yanyan had been roommates for a long time, and there were times when they'd share a room and talk about all the events that had transpired in a day. That's why she didn't need to inform her if she was staying here for the night. However, as she thought back to the helpless look Luo Yanyan had shot her back at the cafe, she couldn't help but feel a little bit uneasy. She quickly washed up and changed her clothes. However, just as Jian Yun was about to head to the other room, she heard her phone ringing. Afraid of waking Huo Liancheng up, she immediately grabbed her phone and answered. Hello? Chapter 29. Is he really that old? The call was from none other than her mother. Yun, what do you think of Mr. Zhao? Jian Yun subconsciously glanced at Huo Liancheng. Seeing as he still hadn't moved from his previous position, she had assumed that he was already in deep sleep. Stepping farther away from the bed, she whispered, This is the first time we've met, Mom. I don't think I've gotten to know him well enough to make any assumptions of him. Even with her hesitance, her mother didn't seem discouraged. Instead, Mrs. Jian laughed. This was definitely a change from the usual screams and lectures she received on all her previous dates. It's fine, dear, she comforted. Besides, Auntie Mao just called and said that her little Joe had quite the impression of you. She asked me if you were interested in continuing to date him, and of course, I agreed on your behalf. Not bothering to listen to any of her mother's blabbering, she rolled her eyes. Just as Jian Yun was about to walk out of the living room, she noticed that his wallet was still buried inside her bag. Taking it out, his ID had fallen out from one of its pockets, allowing her to take a better look. He's handsome, but 32 is a pretty old age now that I think about it. Jian Yun murmured under her breath before shoving it back into his wallet. What are you talking about? He just turned 30 this year, and that's not too old. Besides, you're already 26. It's not like you're any younger. Hearing her daughter's complaints and assuming that it was about the lawyer, Mrs. Jian immediately thought of good things to say about him. After all, from what she had heard, the man was the perfect match for her. You're supposed to be my mother, not his. She sighed, feeling slightly heavy in her heart. Not wanting to hear about how great Zhou Xiaolong was, Jian Yun quickly continued. Mom, it's getting late. You should get some rest, okay? I'm gonna sleep too. All right, just make sure to pick up Zhou Xiaolong's call, all right? With a few more reminders, Mrs. Jian finally hung up. Jian Yun heaved a sigh of relief and dropped the wallet on the bedside table right next to his phone. The leather wallet propped right open, displaying a small, glossy photo. Just as she was about to head out to Luo Yanyan's room, she couldn't help but frown and peer closely at the picture. However, under the dark night, she couldn't really see much. She wasn't generally the type of person to swoop in other people's stuff, but there was something about this photo that had given her a strong sense of déjà vu. A weird feeling crawled up to her chest as she slowly reached for the wallet on the nightstand. However, just as Jian Yun was about to open the wallet to see a clearer silhouette of the woman in the picture, a hand shot out from the shadows and seized her by the wrist. She screamed in fear, stumbling back. Upon turning, she saw that Huo Liancheng was already seated as he stared at her with bloodshot eyes, looking like a monster who had just crept out from the dark. Her hands trembled in fear, and the wallet fell onto the carpet. President Huo, when did you wake up? Jian Yun stammered in guilt. Not only was she caught peeking at his wallet, but seeing how wide alert he was, he must have heard what she had said earlier, right? Her heart fell into the pits of her stomach as she struggled for words. He didn't answer her. Instead, he only said one word, water. She froze for a moment before reacting. As if lightning had struck her core, she sprang back to life and nodded over and over like a broken bobblehead. I'll go get it for you. Without waiting for him to reply, she bent over, placed the wallet back on the nightstand, and turned towards the door. Jian Yun was about to head out when she heard a faint voice coming from behind her. Is 32 really that old? Forgetting that she had yet to open the door, she rammed her head against the hardwood so hard that she could have sworn that she saw stars. Jian Yun stumbled back, blinking back the tears that were threatening to rush down her cheeks. However, even then, she didn't dare turn her head. Pretending as if nothing had happened, she clutched her nose and made a run for it, sprinting like a thief running from the police. By the time she'd gotten out of the room, she gasped out in pain like a fish out of water. It's over. He had heard everything? Using her hand to fan her nose, Jian Yun could only prepare herself for the worst. She squeezed her eyes shut and held back a sigh. Just as everything was getting along just fine, she had to cause another blunder. With President Huo's pettiness, he would surely hold another grudge against her. When Jian Yun had walked back into the room with a cup of water, she saw that Huo Liancheng was already seated upright and leaning against the headstand. His fingers pinched the space in between his eyebrows, looking irritated. Although, from the looks of it, the man still looked drunk. Your water, President Huo. She handed him the cup. When he reached for it, his fingers carelessly grazed the back of her hand. Jian Yun immediately pulled away as if she had just been electrocuted. Her breath hitched and her heart skipped a few beats. Huo Liancheng took this time to glance at her. Her forehead and nose were red from the harsh impact, and her large eyes were filled with unshed tears. She looked like a character that had just popped out from a cartoon. There was a certain smile in his eyes as he gazed at her figure. When he had finally taken the glass, she hesitated before saying, "President Huo, maybe you can tell me your address. I can send you back in." The more she spoke, the softer her voice became. She wasn't even able to finish what she wanted to say as she shuffled farther and farther away from him. Her gaze drifted onto the carpet, suddenly finding the microfibers more interesting than the man sitting right in front of her. Huo Liancheng didn't say a word this entire time. Instead, he simply stared at Jian Yun. The environment around them had grown unusually quiet. Giving up, she finally shook her head. "If you don't mind, you can sleep in my bed then. I can sleep next door." Not giving him a chance to reply, she sprinted out of the room as if she was escaping from a cage. Wu Wenjing was right. Although President Huo was handsome, he was far too detached from happiness. His face was aloof, and his eyes were cold. If she had spent one more minute with him, she might even freeze to death. She had to watch her words when she's around him. Otherwise, he might hold it against her. The moment Jian Yun left, Huo Liancheng put the glass back onto the nightstand and picked up his wallet. He slowly opened it, pulling out a small picture. There was yellowing around the sides, and a few spots danced across the glossy linings. However, the photograph was still in good shape. In the picture, there was a young woman standing in front of a flower wall. Although it was a faint silhouette, there was something about her dazzling smile that could even compete with the brilliance of the flowers surrounding her. At the sight, the corners of his lips twitched upwards. Jian Yun couldn't sleep that night. Not only was she worried about Luo Yanyan, but she was also anxious about bringing Liancheng home tonight. After all, they had only known each other for a few days. Although he looked like a proper, well-educated man, she couldn't help but worry if he'd do something to her in the middle of the night. What was she going to do then? Although she had practiced Taiji fist with her grandfather for a few years, Huo Liancheng would probably put up a fight. She wouldn't know if she'd be able to beat him or not. Her back leaned against the cushions as she suppressed a sigh. From the sight of his tall frame and muscular figure, he might be a strong opponent. However, after a few minutes of thinking and scrutinizing the entire fight, she had finally drifted off to sleep. Jian Yun snuggled under the covers comfortably, unaware that someone was standing beside her this entire time. When she woke up, it was already morning. Squinting, she swung her legs out of the bed as her toes scrunched up the furry carpet underneath the bed. Once Jian Yun had finally mustered the courage to walk out of the room, she saw that Huo Liancheng was already awake. He stood by the window, basking in the warm sunlight. Although he was wearing the same clothes from last night and looked extremely disheveled, he still held the same intimidating aura that could render any man speechless. The spring weather had gradually warmed, and it was far cry from the cold, shattering winds they had experienced recently. The soft air wafted around them, smelling of sweet flowers. Huo Liancheng heard the door creak behind him and turned around. The sunlight clouded around his figure, forming a radiant halo. The hard lines around his face had softened, and his dark eyes were covered with a ray of brightness, making it even harder for people to read him. As he stared at Jian Yun, her breathing sped up and her heart stirred in her chest. Chapter 30. A man with a germaphobe is a nuisance. There was so much tension in the room that Jian Yun couldn't even breathe properly. Lowering her head, she averted her gaze and greeted him, pretending as if nothing had happened that night. "Good morning, President Huo." However, Huo Liancheng wasn't amused. Instead, he raised his wristwatch up in the air, and its surface glinted under the dazzling lights. "It's 9:30, he stated with a deadpanned expression. It had taken her a few seconds to actually register what was happening, and she suddenly jolted. It was 9:30. He must have meant that she had woken up late. Her eyes twitched in annoyance, but she didn't let it show. Did he think she was going to answer his beck and call throughout his entire stay? Although the man was beautiful, his personality was the complete opposite. Pretending not to have gotten the hint, she crossed her arms over her chest and sighed deliberately. If he wanted to play it like this, then fine. "Well, I thought you've already left by now." Jian Yun stared up at him, resisting the urge to snap at Liancheng right in the face. After all, he was still her boss. She had no idea why Huo Liancheng had his eyes on her, but the last thing she wanted was to get into any more trouble. It was better to keep her distance. Jian Yun made it perfectly clear that it was high time for him to leave. However, it seemed that he liked the idea of playing stupid. The man had the nerve to walk straight to the table and sat down like a customer at a restaurant. Without paying heed to her annoyed glances, he said, "I'm hungry." "There are plenty of restaurants downstairs," she pointed out. "It's not clean." Huo Liancheng narrowed his eyes. "Then why don't you find a clean place? I'm sure there are plenty of restaurants that abide by your preferences." Jian Yun rolled her eyes at the back of her mind. A germaphobe was really a nuisance, especially one that didn't have a sense of manners. "The food is far too greasy." He shook his head again like a spoiled child. It was obvious that he made no intention of leaving, but it wasn't like she could kick him out of the house. If she did, then he might even do the same by kicking her right out of the company. "Then what do you want?" she managed to say, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "I only have noodles." "Then noodles it is." Although Huo Liancheng didn't look far too pleased with the idea, he reluctantly agreed. Not bothering with him anymore, she walked past him and into the kitchen. Although the apartment she and Luo Yanyan had rented out only had 2 rooms and a small space to entertain the guests, they had equipped it with a large enough kitchen to cook their meals with. It may not be enough room to whip up some gourmet dishes, but it was definitely enough for them to survive. Jian Yun quickly prepared 2 bowls of noodles and made poached eggs. Once she was finished, she handed it to him. When Jian Yun went into the kitchen and brought out her own bowl, she found that his serving was already half empty. Her jaw dropped. Was he actually this hungry? Didn't he eat last night? Shaking her head, she focused her attention back on her own bowl. Besides, whether he had eaten or not wasn't any of her business anyway. However, just as she was about to take a few bites, she realized that his dark gaze was back on her yet again. A chill shot down her spine. "I'm not full yet," he said when she looked up. Jian Yun glanced at the empty bowl in front of him before placing her chopsticks back down on the table. "I can make you another bowl." Without another word, she headed straight into the kitchen. She had just finished cooking the next batch of noodles when she turned around and saw Liancheng eating from her bowl. The man had absolutely no shame as he slurped up her leftover noodles with an unknown expression painted all over his face. Turning pale with fright and surprise, she rushed towards him. Her hands were shaking in her sides as she struggled to reach for her bowl. He dodged her waving arms, pretending as if nothing had happened. "Hey!" she yelled out in protest. "That's my bowl." "Well, I can't wait that long." Not being able to snatch it away, she could only stare at him as he slurped the noodles from her bowl, like a man who hadn't eaten in days. Although her cooking skills weren't that bad, she couldn't help but be confused. Wasn't he supposed to be a germaphobe? When he had helped her back then, didn't he wipe his hands with a wet tissue in the most exaggerated fashion? Didn't he want to eat here because the other places weren't up to his cleanliness standards? Yet, he didn't mind a used spoon. How strange. Just this second, a phone rang, interrupting the quiet and peculiar atmosphere. The mood had shifted as Huo Liancheng fished his phone from his pockets and answered the call. He walked towards the window, and his words became hushed. From the sound of it, he seemed to be talking about the business. Not wanting to disturb him, Jian Yun turned around and walked back into the kitchen. She still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing him eating from her bowl, so she was still in a daze. Jian Yun had just woken up that morning, but despite her tousled hair and unkempt clothes, she still looked rather adorable. Although she was only wearing an old sweater and a pair of jeans, they still hugged around her slender figure. A few strands of hair clung to her face, further highlighting her pale but beautiful face. If she had turned around, she would have seen that Huo Liancheng's eyes had never left her. Not even for a second. When she had finished up cooking the bowl of noodles and came out once again, she saw that the 2 bowls were already empty. Huo Liancheng was already buttoning up his suit, looking obviously disgruntled from the sudden interruption. Jian Yun, however, was like a child on Christmas Day. Her tired eyes immediately brightened as all the pent-up frustration she had for the man had immediately left her system. "President Huo, are you leaving?" Under her fervent gaze, he frowned. A dark look flashed across his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. If it were up to him, he would have stayed here all day. Yet it seemed that the woman wanted nothing more than to drive him out of her apartment. She stared up at him, unmoved by his aloof features. After all, Huo Liancheng had already overstayed his welcome, and she'd do anything just to send him right out of her doorsteps. He was about to walk towards the door in annoyance when he heard the next few words coming out of her lips. "Wait a minute." His eyebrows twitched, and the corners of his lips slightly raised. Did she change her mind after all? However, just as he was about to turn around and greet her, car keys were placed onto his palm. Its hard metal scraped against his skin, and he gritted his teeth. "Your keys, President Huo. I won't be sending you downstairs." Jian Yun smiled up at him and waved. Finally, at long last, the man was leaving. Exhaling, Huo Liancheng clenched his hand around the keys and stomped out of the room. He slammed the door behind him so loud that she could have sworn the entire building must have heard it. Without another word, he walked into the elevator without turning back. Was he angry? Jian Yun stared at his retreating back, raising her eyebrows. It wasn't like she was offending him or anything. Or was it because she wasn't fawning over him like all the other women he had met? Did she hurt his ego? Forget it. If he wasn't happy, then so be it. It wasn't like she was there to please him. Jian Yun turned and was about to get the noodles from the counter when the doorbell rang. Her thoughts immediately went to Liancheng coming back, and her blood had turned cold. However, when she saw that it was Luo Yanyan who had opened the door, she sighed in relief. She had enough of that man for the day. Yun, guess what I just saw? As soon as Luo Yanyan stepped into the apartment, she immediately jumped in front of Jian Yun as if she had just discovered a new continent. With glowing eyes, she grinned. I saw the most handsome man entering the elevator, and oh my god, it was like seeing a celebrity. I take that back. He's better than any celebrity I've ever seen. There are around 3 rooms on this floor, so I wonder which one he came from. I was so tempted to ask for his name. I've cooked noodles. Do you want some? Jianyun immediately changed the topic, not having the heart to tell her the truth. He may have been the most good-looking man in the entire country, but his words were enough to annoy the people to death. That alone was a huge turnoff. I've already eaten. It was then when Luo Yanyan noticed a large bowl sitting at the table. She frowned. It looked as if her friend had already eaten, and there was a certain aristocratic scent wafting across the air. Hesitating, she turned back to Jianyun. Did you invite anyone over? The handsome guy earlier, was he your visitor? In your dreams. I only needed the bowl to fill in the soup. She waved her hand, rolling her eyes. Jianyun didn't want anyone to know that Huo Liancheng had stayed overnight with her. If a man and a woman were assumed to have spent the night together, no one would believe it if they had said that nothing happened. It would just lead to more useless gossip. Although she didn't want to hide it from Luo Yanyan, if she did find out, she'd definitely ask Wu Wenjing about it. And everyone knew how much of a big mouth her other friend had. If Wu Wenjing were to know what had happened, the news would have been all over the office. Yanyan, why didn't you come back to the apartment last night?